Well, returning to our top story now, the report into last year's devastating Queensland floods. Let's get some more background from Ed Blakely. He's with the US Study Centre and is an urban planning and disaster recovery expert. He's been following the inquiry's progress and has read the interim report from the inquiry. He joins me now from Melbourne. Ed Blakely, many thanks for joining us once again. What is likely to come from this report in terms of the cooperation between councils? Because, of course, there were so many different local councils that were involved in the disaster response and the recovery.
Well, the councils will have to cooperate and collaborate because there are new fresh requirements that the floodplain mapping and associated flooding information be shared with them, and they develop plans that are consistent with this information. Councils that are close together and share creeks and rivers will have to collaborate in order to come up with those plans. I think this doesn't go far enough. I would favor the notion of regionalizing that planning process so that the councils would work together by requirement. That is, councils sharing the same river basin would have a common plan about where to build and where not to build. The reason for this is very simple. If Council A says you can't build here, then the developer goes over to Council B, where it may not be clear, gets approval, and Council A looks like a fool. So if it's all standard across an entire region, then development takes place where you want it to take place. Much of our problem in this country is that we don't have plans in the same way that plans are made elsewhere in the UK and the United States, where the plan acts as a regulatory framework and the developers have to work within that. In our country, the developer brings the plan and then the government reacts to it. It'd be much better to have plans laid out saying, here's where residential should take place, here's where businesses should take place. Developers, how would you execute this? Or if you have a better idea for this area, please present it. But in many cases, we have no idea, and the developer presents the idea, and then he or she puts the council on the back foot.
Okay, so if the report doesn't go far enough in that it doesn't standardise the response for regions as opposed to councils, I wonder what your thoughts are on the floodplains and this requirement for zones of risk to be labelled. Should the report have gone further in terms of actually saying what kind of development, if any, should continue on floodplain areas?
I think it should have. This is not a science that is unknown. The Dutch, for example, have very good science that underpins their planning processes for flooding. The UK has very good processes for this. The United States is not quite as good as it should be. But this is not a science we don't know something about. We know what dangers there are in high-risk areas. And I think it would be perfectly appropriate to have an overall state commission that said, here are areas that are inappropriate for building anything that you cannot retreat from. For example, like tin sheds and things like this, warehousing, might be put in a floodplain because no people are involved. Agriculture could go on in many floodplains. But housing developments, no. More concrete, more roads, no. It's not difficult to do. We just have to have the will to do it.
Obviously, that's something, too, that will involve a lot of resources if people have to be moved, if businesses have to be moved. Do you have a degree of disappointment that the report's authors didn't go further?
A little degree of disappointment, but they do have, in one of the chapters, a proposal to buy back sensitive habitat in areas that are dangerous. That's been going on in New South Wales for many years, and New South Wales has not suffered as much from flooding as other places. So I think we do have sensible techniques that can be used to reduce these dangerous situations. Finally, I think it's important to take this kind of the next step. Who should make these decisions? My view is they should be made much like Western Australia with its planning commission, where you have a mixture of bureaucrats and independents sitting down and hammering out regulatory frameworks that the legislature endorses, and then after that you have people who carry that out, who are administratively responsible for carrying it out, and not the situation where every council can make up its own rules and say it's conforming to some master plan, but that master plan is never looked at when the council makes its rules.
Does this also have some implications for developments of CBDs that are on the sides, right, on the river banks, really?
It does. It certainly does. And some CBDs that are on riverbanks edge, like Ipswich and so forth, have to have some reinforcement. Perhaps they would move some things that are dangers. You don't want hospitals and schools located there. But that could be done over time. It doesn't have to be done immediately.
Okay. What about the recommendation that the Crime and Misconduct Commission investigate the conduct of the flood engineers? Is that an attempt to kind of pin down some type of responsibility for the aftermath of the flooding?
As I understand it, the investigation is of the report they wrote, not necessarily the conduct that they did. And clearly these are linked. But if they falsified a report and said they did things that they didn't do, of course this is perjury, and that has to be looked at. And I want to be cautious here, because this will be subject to criminal and maybe even civil litigation. So it's very important that we make sure that we are looking at the right thing. What was the report they wrote? What was their actual conduct? And was any of this criminal? And if it were to be found that, then they should be dealt with like anyone else who has a public responsibility.
To what extent does this report represent some kind of closure for the hundreds of people who were involved in this disaster, or does it really open up a whole new chapter of recrimination?
I think it opens up a new chapter. The report signals things that might have been done, that could have been done, things that insurance companies should do, etc. People who lost their property will be surprised that the insurance companies will seize pieces of this report to defend themselves. On the other hand, people will find pieces of the report, particularly groups, entire groups, for class actions. So there's going to be an awful lot of litigation going on. I wish I'd sent my kids to law school.
Just one final question. It did seem to say that the disaster response by the state government and government authorities was fairly good. Is that likely to provide some comfort, if not at least to the Premier?
Yes, it is. But let me say something about that. We should not take solace in how well we respond to a disaster. We should take solace, like we do with Qantas, that they don't have disasters. So we should be putting out plans and programs that limit the impact of disasters, that build where we should. And in regards to what one thinks about climate change, we know the weather is changing, and it's becoming more severe. And if we don't take appropriate actions now, we'll certainly pay later.
Okay, so learning as opposed to backslapping. Ed Blakely, many thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much.